That's right. Thanks very much. Thanks for coming. Thanks for being here. So methodological values for time discounting. What I want to offer here is something that is maybe a bit different in that it's not really climate ethics, it's not really climate economics, but it's a perspective from the philosophy of science on some methodological issues on time discounting. And so why am I interested in talking about time discounting as a philosopher of science, as a philosopher of economics? Well, discounting is special. So I think it's among the most controversial topics in economics. There's a lot of debate, not only within economics, but also in lots of other areas, lots of other sciences, but also in the public arena. So there's a lot of controversy, and we've also seen already yesterday that there's also a lot of there's a lot of ways in which these disagreements seem to be very hard to pin down, also in the conversations between climate ethicists, for instance, and climate economists. And so that's one thing. On the other hand, when you look at the methodology, there's an unusually low amount of competition within economics for the right sort of methodology to debate intergenerational discounting. There's not a lot of diversity in the methodology. And so, as philosophers of science, we often think of physics sort of as the baseline case, and if you think about physics, then there's Newton, and then 300 years later you have Einstein or so. So that's a long time scale. For economics, which is a very young discipline, to have the foundations of a methodology laid out around 80, 90 years ago and still be using that methodology is also a very large time frame. And so I just think these two things seem to be in tension, and it's just interesting to get out the toolbox of the philosopher of science and think about this a little bit more. So what I want to do is to go through 4 things that we might want to talk about from a philosophy of science perspective, look at Kuhn's theoretical virtues, look at representation requirements, look at the value-free idea, and finally at ethical and epistemic judgments. So I'll be emphasizing a few things a bit more and a few things a bit less when compared to the paper here, but I hope you can bear with me. So let's start with the most general or the most obvious idea, Kuhn's theoretical virtues. So Kuhn in 1972 has said, well, if we have to choose between different theories, it might be important to know according to what sort of values, what sort of theoretical values we're going to make this theory choice. And he said here's 5 epistemic virtues or theoretical virtues that theories should embody and that we should compare different theories. So he said the theory should be accurate. That means that within its domain it should make the right sort of prediction. It should be consistent internally but also compatible with other theories adjacent to it. It should be simple. So in Kuhn's word, it should bring order into the phenomena. It should have broad scope and be fruitful, so be also conducive to advancing science in various ways. And so one thing we could do, which I won't do, is to think about, for instance, the Ramsey rule with regards to these theoretical virtues. The problem a little bit is that in intergenerational discounting, there's not a lot of different theories to choose from yet. So, well, there's Eschheim, there's Flobet and Zuber, there's also the papers in this workshops program where we see a little bit more diversity, but it's not as if we say here's theory A, here's theory B, and now we compare which theory maximizes these kinds of virtues and then we make our choice. So what we have to do is kind of make this sort of evaluation in the abstract to kind of just say, well, is the Ramsey approach, is it accurate, is it consistent? And that kind of just could go either way, and it seems maybe not such an interesting thing to do. But I do think that given that we have rivaling accounts of the Ramsey approach to intergenerational discounting just coming out, this will be different in the future. So we will be able to, for instance, do these kinds of comparisons and may be able to say something about the respective theoretical virtues of different theories in this regard. So this is kind of an outlook into into future work that will a little bit depend on how the field moves on. A second thing is that as a philosopher of science, what you say as well, if you see something like numerical values being assigned, if there are functions, if there are numbers, then you may want to ask, well, what sort of representation exercises underlie these numbers? Philosophers of science workhorse for this is the representational theory of measurement that underlies most of the foundational work in economics. And so in this work we say whenever we have the assignment of numbers, so a certain measurement exercise, then we better have a representation theorem that underwrites that. So, for instance, so this is something that has been developed basically at the same time as utility theory. And so, in a sense, you can think of utility theory of preferences represented by a utility function as a special case of the representational theory of measurement. So that you say you have a qualitative relational structure, for instance, a set of rods of different length, and you compare them, and then you map these comparisons into a numerical relational structure, provided that the comparison between these rods satisfies certain axioms. For instance, that if you put two rods together that are longer than the one, then these are larger. And if these kinds of comparisons are, for instance, transitive and complete and so on, then you get some nice properties of this numerical assignment, and you know what sort of qualitative comparisons you have now represented numerically. And so this is something that we are used to in utility theory. We're used to do this in probability, for instance. So these are all instances of satisfying such representation requirements. So for a discounting function that assigns numerical values to time points, very generally here, or maybe a bit more specifically here, we might expect such a representation theorem. And what's interesting to me is that we don't really have it. What we have is we have indirect representation theorems for individual time preference. So there's a tradition in economic theory to say we have a utility representation of preference. We amend that we have a discounted utility representation of time preference, and a discounting function falls out of that representation. It's an indirect representation theorem. And it is good enough to discuss some conceptual issues with regards to individual time preference. But in social discounting, because we have the Ramsey rule, we don't really have such a representation framework. We talk about social discounting much differently. So what this means as a philosopher of science is that this sort of nice workhorse of a representation theorem is not really applicable to this case. We can't really say what social discounting in the Ramsey approach is doing because it seems to not fall under this. There's an argument maybe to be made for that to be a worry in and of itself, that we don't have that we seem to operate with numbers that are not underwritten by a representation theorem, but that's I just leave that as a thought. So the upshot of this is also that we can't really use this quite pertinent idea in philosophy of science to really evaluate social discounting in the Ramsey approach as much as we maybe like to do. Right, so that's two ideas from philosophy of science that we often use to talk about this out of the way. There's also some work on values in science that we can often refer to. So this idea of values in science refers back to an idea of science being value-free. So the idea that scientific findings shouldn't be justified by referring to non-epistemic, so moral or political or social values. And there's a long-standing debate in philosophy of science about whether there can be any value-free science or not. So there's this infamous paper by Rudner entitled "The Scientist Qua Scientist Makes Value Judgments," and then there's a lot of debate in philosophy of science on how we can still carve out a space for value-free science. And so this really refers to all sciences, also the natural sciences. I don't have time to go into that debate very deeply, but it's safe to say there's a widespread consensus amongst philosophers of science nowadays that studying carefully how non-epistemic values interfere in science and how they should and how they shouldn't is something that is of importance, because it also relates to how society reacts to science and what sort of democratic control we may want to have over science, but also what sort of autonomy science should have with respect to maybe moral and critical values being imposed on them. So this is a contentious area. Now, it seems that in economics, and in discounting in economics, it seems an obvious case for values being quite central in both theory and policy making, just very generally. I'm not saying anything specific yet. And it's also an instance of many economists just simply making a lot of ethical statements about various things concerning the theory, concerning measurement, concerning how this should work in practical applications. And so it seems that we have a case here of deep theoretical entanglement between facts and values. So it seems to be an area where facts and values interact quite a lot. So I'm not saying this is bad news or good news, I'm just saying that seems to be what happens. So there's a debate, or there has been a debate, a very intense one actually, between philosophers and economists about how the value-free ideal in science should relate to economics or not. So on the one hand, we had, in the economics corner, we had Partha Gupta, and in the philosophy corner, we had Hilary Putnam and Vivian Walsh. And so there was a long discussion over whether any part of economics can in principle be free from ethical value judgments. And so in a sense, I can also not really go into all of this debate, but safe to say this might be a debate that we may want to look at. And so here's a paper by Su and Colander that summarizes this debate, and they say, well, Putnam and Walsh missed Dasgupta's pragmatic arguments about how to move forward in tentatively separating positive truths from normative rules, even while accepting that on a deep level they may not be fully separable. Instead of letting fact-value entanglement lead one to an impasse, one distinguishes those factual judgments and normative judgments that are most separable, accepts that others are not, and gets on with one's analysis. So, entanglement of facts or values notwithstanding, it seems that we could still, if we are aware of it, get on with the job. But so here it seems to me that in discounting we don't really have that to be widely shared. So there's lots of disagreement about whether, for instance, the Ramsey rule is something descriptive or normative. There seem to be lots of arguments about which parts of the Ramsey rule are more normative or more descriptive, or what sort of description should have a bearing on what sort of normative parts of it. And so it seems to me also here that it doesn't seem to be very fruitful to apply this value-free idea or these debates about entanglements between facts and values to the discounting case, because I'm not so sure how much we learn from doing that. And so, so far, this has really been sort of basically, I've been sharing with you my failed attempts to make sense of discounting as a philosopher of science. I mean, these are really three bread and butter approaches in the philosophy of science, yet they don't really seem to give us a lot of understanding of what's really happening in this debate, or why it is so complicated. I mean, to be sure, we can be very critical about the Ramsey rule by looking at all these three things, but in a sense I kind of feel like I want to go a bit further. So one thing I want to argue for is that instead of focusing so much on this distinction between facts and values and to try to maintain the value-free ideal, maybe we should just be a bit more careful in saying whether we are in the business of making an ethical or an epistemic judgment. So instead of focusing on facts and values, maybe we should say it's a good idea, and this is a weaker requirement, to say, well, are we in a given case, in a given science, interested in an epistemic judgment, Or are we interested in an ethical judgment? And then we can say an epistemic judgment, well, it's focused on identifying facts, but of course we can leave open the question what kinds of values go into making that judgment. I could try to identify the unemployment rate in France. And I could come back and say, well, all the 5-year-olds in France seem to be unemployed. And then somebody would say, well, we don't count that. And that's a value judgment, right? But it's not, we shouldn't then throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, well, therefore it's all ethical and so on. We're still in the business of making an epistemic judgment. Likewise, for ethical judgments, we can say, well, we focus on identifying the right sort of values. But of course, we also need to take into account the right kinds of facts, and we need to get the facts straight, or we can use our understanding of the facts to know what sort of ethical judgments we can make. And it seems to me that that's a distinction we should really strive for. It's a lot weaker than saying there are facts and values and they're separate or they should be separate. In fact, making this distinction is consistent with a variety of positions you may have about the old fact and value question. And so separating as epistemic and ethical judgments is something that does not work in the social discount rate very well. So for instance, delta is seen as an ethical judgment, but then we seem to smuggle this epistemic judgment of the uncertainty of extinction of humankind in there. And so it doesn't seem to really be clear whether this delta business is about ethical or epistemic judgments. They're kind of shoved in there together. Eta, ultimately, it's seen as an ethical judgment by many people, but of course it depends on many different factors in the model and many different epistemic projects within figuring out our integrated assessment model. The growth rate is seen as an epistemic judgment. Maybe this is slightly less problematic. So I do think that a failure to separate between projects of ethical and epistemic judgments within this methodology may be part of an explanation for why both the intra but also the interdisciplinary debates about discounting have been so confusing to many of the participants, because that would be, if we would be clear on these kinds of projects, whether we're interested in making an ethical and epistemic judgment, we may also have a better understanding of the respective division of labor between different participants in the debate. So, just to conclude, I've been trying to reflect on the Ramsey rule from the perspective of philosophy of science. There's a variety of frameworks that I've tried out. I do think there's reason to be critical that some of these staple concepts like Kuhn's virtues, the representation idea are not really straightforwardly applicable. I think it's interesting to note that the entanglement of facts and values seems to be a problem, and that also a lot of economists are basically not in the project of saying we all want to be value-free when we're discounting. And I think most damning is this problem of ethical and epistemic judgments being entangled in this methodology. So that's maybe a bit different from the paper that I sent to you, which may be a challenge to my commentator, to which I hand over now. Thanks very much.